Rating and the legal status of animals in the French civil an article from by John Mark Newman. Okay,
Okay.
um,
Começou.
yeah, bien sûr.
Ok, tá bom. Então, so today I'm gonna present you this article written by Jean-Marc Neumann, a French professor at the University of Strasbourg and pioneer in the area of animal law as a field of study in the country, since he was the first one in giving an animal law course in a university in France. So the articles deals with the previous events that led to the enactment of Wednesday, 28th of January 2015 of the historical law acknowledging the status of living and sentient beings to animals in the Civil Code. So let's begin. First of all, Neumann starts mentioning the philosophical legacy in France, which helps us to better understand why it has been so long before the status of animals finally got to change in the Civil Code. So through Renaissance, human beings are going to replace, in a certain extent, the place that God occupied in our societies, turning themselves, the humans, in the center of preoccupation. So thanks to this movement, various sectors of the society are going to emancipate themselves progressively from the yoke of religion and become more independent systems with their own logic and rules. So in this context, sciences are going to experiment several revolutions, which will jeopardize what had been until then the conception that human had of the world. So Descartes, a French mathematician, born at 60 kilometers at the south of Tours, in a small village that took his name, is one of the main motors of this evolution in the fields of science and philosophy. So his theory was the mechanical theory. So in short, Descartes, in an attempt to give unicity to the world and explain nature and all the physical phenomena with rational and objective rules, developed the so-called mechanical theory. If God originated nature and its laws, he does not manifest himself in every event that indeed take place. Events only occur thanks to a relation of cause and effect, including in biological bodies. In the same manner that a machine does not need its creator to function once set in motion, the world evolves without God through these relations of cause and effect. So, regarding the question of animals, Descartes said that it won't seem strange, knowing how diverse automatons or movable machines the industry of man is capable of producing, without using in it but a very few number of pieces in relation with the great quantity of bones, muscles, nerves, arteries, veins, and all the existing parts in the animal body, to consider this body as a machine that, having been made by the hands of God, is incomparably better organized and capable of more remarkable movements than any one that could be created by humans. So this quote from the book Discourse on the Method, thanks to this conception, Descartes saw animals are mere machines devoid of the capacity to feel, to think, or ratiocinate. As it could be programmed on a clock that at a certain moment a sound would be triggered, the shouts of animals were only seen to be reactions set up by God. So according to Descartes, animals emulated pain without feeling it. Yes. So this theory had a great impact and was very persistent. First of all, in the field of sciences, in the time that was elaborated the theory, it has a huge impact. and it resulted in a clear worsening of animal condition, especially concerning trials and experimentations, during which, because of the Cartesian view, animal suffering were totally disregarded. So it's interesting that as it happened before with the arrival of Christianism in Rome and the resulting expansion of the Roman sphere of consideration to a growing number of humans, the reform of the thought carried out throughout Renaissance had a rather good effect on the position of humans as individuals in our society, but in relation with animals, it just made things worse. We can say it was the worst moment for animals, the worst conception, because it deprived them of all consideration. It deprived them of all sensuousness, and even the small part of the soul that the Greeks thought that animals had, with the Cartesian theory, it disappeared. So more than 150 years later, the publication of this book, the conception was still having quite an influence, and it was not a surprise that animals made the entry in the civil code as things considered as chattel or real property, as mentioned by Neumann. So, as the author underscores, there is a true patchwork of provisions in the French law. There is no code, no set of law where all the legislation linked with animals can be found in the French legal framework. Rules applicable to animals pertains to different branches of the law, as statutes regulating our use and relation with animals can be encountered in the civil, penal, environmental, or rural and marine fishing codes. And we can find a multiplicity of sources, as the actual set of rules that we can find in French law is derived from national sources as well as European sources. So the author makes a quick review of each code's approach concerning the animals, starting with the rural and marine fishing code. So every animal, being a sentient being, must be placed by its owner in conditions compatible with its biological requirements. So this article, L 214-1, this is the fruit of an act adopted on the 10th of July, 1976. And back then, it was at the cutting edge of the legislation, only 1 year after the publication of Peter Singer's bestseller Animal Liberation. The statutes take this stance with the anthropocentric approach, positing that animals must be protected for themselves and not in order to advance a human interest. So it was the first text in France in acknowledging explicitly the sentience of animals. But what we can note, however, is that the article refers to the owner of the animal. In other terms, it concerns only domestic animals. That is to say, in accordance with the Muriel Fallès definition of domestic animals, animals which are animals on which humans exert a power, an action, an authority. So all wild animals are then excluded from the scope of the statutes. So that is it for the rural and marine fishing code. Now let's move on with the penal code, which is the criminal law is the field which was the first one to address the question of animal treatment. Several landmarks are noteworthy. So first of all, the Grammont Act, approved on the 2nd of July, 1850. So this act, the proponent of the law, who took his name, was Mr. Jacques Delmas de Gramont. He was a deputy and general, and he was a cavalry officer that was particularly sensitive to the fate of horses who had fought beside man in battlefield. So he's the same person that originated the law, is the one that created the French League of Horse Protection, which still exists today. So this act, however, was not a real breakup with the classical approach, with the anthropocentric approach, as it perpetuated this bias. It perpetuated this view, providing that will be punished of a 5,000 francs fine and maybe from 1 to 5 days of jail those who will have publicly and unfairly exert bad treatments towards domestic animals. So as we can see, the public condition of the acts of bad treatment shows that the aim of the act, as it is said by the author of the article, the aim of the act was ultimately to protect the public moral and order and not the animal in itself. So we're excluded of the sphere of application of the law all wild animals and all violences against domestic animals that took place in the private domain. So, in my opinion, I think this law was quite important, even if it was only protecting a few animals. It was important because we can see it as an implicit recognition of the animal sensitiveness, because it would have no sense to prohibit bad treatment towards chairs, for example. And the fact that public morality be affected by violence with animals shows that in the mind of people, animals are not mere machines, and that mistreating them is not something anodine, insignificant. It means something. So it shows that in the mind of people, even in the 19th century, the thought had evolved, and we were not with the Cartesian approach as 200 years before. So beyond the fact that this law was not really comprehensive, Jean-Marc Neumann points out that it was not fully enforced in reality, as practices supposed to be forbidden went on in spite of the law. So he relates what happened with the ruling of the Cour de Cassation on the 6th of February 1895, where bulls were included as domestic animals. So as a consequence of the jurisprudence and in accordance with the Gramont law, such activities, bullfighting, should have been seen as illegal. However, regions where this tradition was part of the culture decided to simply bypass, to simply ignore such norm coming from the distant and vain Paris, and they kept on with bullfighting for decades until the legislature bent to regional tradition and excluded bullfighting from the scope of the Gramont Act. So this was what happened with the act of the 24th of April 1951, who constituted a regression in the protection of animals, and it shows the limits of animal protection laws when it comes to cultural traditions, whether religious or not. In the case, it was not religious, but often animal protection is reduced because of religious arguments. So that's it. So then the next improvement in the French legislation was with the Michelet Decree of 7th of July 1959. This law meant an evolution of the perspective, of the anthropocentric perspective, as it suppressed the publicity condition of the Grammont Act. So the question was not anymore to protect humans, but yes, to safeguard an animal interest. So people may think, I've read that under Kantian perspective, the true objective of the law could have been to protect man, because mistreating an animal under perspective of Kant could be considered as disrespect, as a show of disrespect to oneself. So some people will think that even with the suppression of the public condition, we're still in an anthropocentric view. But in my opinion, this law was more focused on the animal than on humans. So then in 1963, the cruelty offense was created. So the author underscores that even if the criminal code still does not acknowledge explicitly the census of animals, it does it implicitly because of the cruelty penalty. So it little bit the same argument that I used with the Grammont Act. In my opinion, it was already the case with Grammont Act, but it's true that it was reinforced by the creation of the cruelty offense. And after this, the penalties were reinforced too in 1999. And the last and final noteworthy event that was that took place in the field of criminal law was the adoption of the new Penal Code of 1992. It was an event because it separated the part dealing with offenses to goods from the one pertaining to offenses to animals. So making a difference, underlying that it was not the same thing to offense a good than to offense an animal, making a difference there. So that's it for the Penal Code. Now the Environmental Code, as the author argues, with good reasons, this code is more aimed at protecting humans from animals seen as danger for economy mainly than the contrary. Animals are considered from a species perspective, as always when it has to do with wild animals, and are classified according to the dangers they carry with them for human activities. So this approach of seeing animals as species appears to be more and more cut off from reality, and even from the view of ethologists. To support this affirmation, it suffices with reading testimonies from people who studied, from scientists who studied closely wild animals, such as monkeys or cheetahs. And for example, as to this last species, cheetah, the French biologist Yves Christian, who spent years of his life observing them, relates in his book L'animal est une personne, the differences between each individual's features, personality, and underscores the fact that each animal, each cheetah in the case, is a product of his own personal history and therefore is unique. So he shows that considering animals as species is inconsistent, seeing the character, the individuality of each animal. So in this context, the protection of animals is only taken into account in the Environmental Code thanks to European legislation. Indeed, in the field of European law, the census of animals is entrenched in the legal framework as the Article 13 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, part of the primary law, in other terms of the Constitution of the Union, states that in formulating and implementing the Union's agriculture, fisheries, transport, internal market, research and technological development, and space policies, the Union and the Member States shall, since animals are sentient beings, pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals, while respecting the legislative and administrative provisions and customs of the Member States relating in particular to religious rights, cultural traditions, and regional heritage. So, in keeping with this, directives are enacted at the European level and has to be incorporated in national law, as the one mentioned by the author of the article about the conservation of wild birds of November 2009. So the problem is, as it is said, as it is pointed out by the author, that in a large measure, because of a very powerful hunting lobbying, lots of hunters bypass these rules with the indulgence of French authorities, which is a big problem. So that's it. Now let's go on. So after this short sum up of the main legislation dealing with animals in French laws, the author relates the close backgrounds of the 2015 Act, sorry. So from the study of French body of laws regarding animals, we can say that France was facing a strong inconsistency regarding its legal framework in relation with animals. As on the one hand, in two codes, the penal and the rural and marine fishing codes, and through European rules, animals were considered as sentient beings, and on the other hand, the civil code was still contemplating animals as mere objects of property, as means used by humans to satisfy their needs. So before such incoherencies, the Minister of Justice, Dominique Perben, entrusted Suzanne Antoine, member of the Animal Rights, Ethics and Sciences Foundation, to make a report on the legal regime of animals in France under a comparative law approach and proposing modifications that could put an end to the inconsistencies. So amongst other ideas, the report endorsed the creation of a new category sui generis, different from the goods and the persons reserved to animals. So in spite of the first eagerness, the project did not result in any acts, proposal, let alone modification of the civil code. And the decisive impulsion came from the deputy, Jean Glavany, who submitted to the general surprise an amendment to the bill on the modernization and simplification of the law and procedures in the domains of justice and internal affairs. So the amendment was dealing with the status of animals, acknowledging the fact that animals are living and sentient beings. So Jean-Marc Neumann comes back on the discrepancies between the more conservative Senate and the National Assembly when this amendment was proposed. So we can quote one senator, Mohamed Tani Soilili, when he said, above all, in what respect made the statement animals are living and sentient beings have any normative value. So this quote shows the concern shared by many parliamentary regarding the possible consequences of this recognition. So despite the claim from Glavany that it was more a symbolic change than a truly normative one, the mistrust of lots of senators translated in the anxiety of many farmers. In a highly competitive economy, especially inside the European Union, an increase of production costs caused by a modification of law in only one country can lead to a very strong decrease of income for farmers. That is why many senators were against, pushed by the fear that it will have bad consequences on the agricultural world. So this is confirmed by a deputy this time, Mr. Gosselin, when he professes that we need to measure all consequences, and here I feel that the consequences have not been adequately assessed. Tomorrow, agriculture, hunting may be threatened. So in spite of these arguments, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the author, this argumentation was quite baseless, as the status of animals as sentient being is and was present at the time these declarations were made in legislation with a greater value than a civil code. Indeed, as we have said before, the census of animals was already enshrined by the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And this treaty has the same value in the French legal framework than the Constitution. So it has more value. It has more value than the civil code. And even with this reality, it didn't have any relevant impacts on the property regime applicable to animals. So the fears of senators and a few members of the National Assembly was quite baseless. The aim was only to adapt the civil code to the rest of the legal framework, so that the civil code would not remain in the field of animal law, as it tends to happen with frequency in other domains, a monument of legal history disconnected from the reality of current laws. So because the civil code is quite complicated, they are very reticent to change it. It happened with contracts. The rules applicable to contracts were mainly in other codes than the civil codes, and the civil codes had in it laws and rules that in reality were not applicable and were not used during were not used by judges in their decisions. So the reaction of the periodical lobs, referring to the fact that public opinion was widely in favor of this reform, is interesting, as it reflects the distance that can exist between law and what people think, especially with a highly conservative text at the civil code. So Lobs is a periodical that is a left-wing periodical, but still it was interesting, and the author quoted it. So conclusion: after these many changes of direction, the text was finally approved by the National Assembly on 16th of February 2015. So the author, so it was the Senate never approved the law, but the Senate in France is elected a little bit like the president in the United States. That is to say, people elect what we call great or big electors, and then these electors, a few thousands, will vote for the senators. Whereas for deputy, it is the people that votes directly. So it gives the National Assembly a bigger legitimacy than the Senate. So in the Constitution, in almost every question, there are a few questions where Senate has the last word, but in almost every other areas, it is the National Assembly that decides. And when there is a discrepancy, well, it's is this chamber that will have the last word. So the author says that animals are not more property in French law, which seems to be a little bit optimistic, as the author himself recognizes a few lines later that animals can still be sold, used, in a word, exploited as before. Moreover, if we see the structure, if you look at the structure of the civil code, animals are still placed under the regime of goods, as every other thing. So the evolution, this recognition is far more symbolic than really efficient in the level of animal protection, as it is underlined by Jean-Marc Neumann. We are facing a paradox, as reality nowadays in France is that in spite of this recognition, each time more industrial farms are popping up on the territory, submitting a growing number of animals to bad living conditions. And the truth is that we can't blame the farmers for this, as their decreasing number, due without a doubt to the extreme conditions of work, far away from the legal base of 35 hours a week. It is the legal base in France of work since 1994, when the left was in the power. It's 35 hours a week, but farmers work like 70, 80 hours a week, and all this work for trifling wage, they receive in return for their hard work. So these conditions make that today 2.6% of the active population is in charge of feeding the rest of the French mouth. So they were, as a comparison, they were 43% in the beginning of the 20th century, so 150 years ago. The direct consequences are more intensive production methods and almost invariably more animal sufferings, because today majority of people lives in the cities, and being a farmer is not a work that make people dream, most people. So even sons, daughters of farmers sell the farm of their father, grandfather, great grandfather, because of working conditions. They sell it to bigger industrial company, and it makes that all the farms are in hands of a very few number of people. Until now, it's not as in Germany here. France has still a quite divided parts of territory. It's not like there are not like 100 companies that share all the territory and feed everybody, but more and more it's being like concentrated in a few hands, with big industrial production and with conditions pretty bad for animals. So we can say, to conclude, that the 2015 Civil Code modification is a major event because it enshrines a growing interest in preoccupation for animal welfare. However, this won't result in an effective improvement of most animals' lives until we adjust our habits to our way of thinking. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thomas Bayan. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's start the debate, okay?
I stop